Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. Today we have an in-depth philodendron care tips video. It's been a long time since I've done a care tips type of video, but they're generally pretty popular, especially if you've picked up a new plant and you're trying to figure out what is the best way to care for this type of plant. Now, I've approached this as philodendron, as a genus, as a whole, for growing indoors as a houseplant. And I decided to do this because while there may be some philodendron that require maybe a little bit more of specific care, such as maybe higher humidity or lower light or whatever, I find in my experience of growing them for a couple of years now that in general they like a lot of the same thing. So it's kind of a blanket care tips. Typically philodendron will enjoy this type of care. It is probably the genus that I have grown the most, and I'm probably the most experienced in this genus, to be very honest. And it's obviously one of my favorites for that very reason. Philodendron is a large genus, and we will go into a little bit of a background on philodendron as a whole. I feel this is a really good way to lay a foundation on what we were trying to look at before we get into how to care for them in the home. So the philodendron genus is a very large genus of flowering plants. They are from the family Araceae, which I'm sure that you've heard, and the subfamily Aroideae, as in your aroids. So as of September 2015, there are 485 described species in the philodendron genus. However, it is thought that there are probably a large number of undiscovered species within this genus. It is the second largest genus in the Araceae family after the number one, which is your lovely anthuriums, which some of you may enjoy and grow in your home. The name philodendron is actually from a Greek origin, philo meaning love or affection, and dendron meaning tree. So they love trees, which is actually such a fantastic name and is a great descriptor on what these plants generally like, their habitat, and what helps them to grow into mature plants. Because of this, philodendron are rarely a terrestrial species. They're generally either epiphytic or hemiepiphytic, meaning hemi as in they'd only spend part of their life cycle being epiphytic, and epiphytic means growing on another plant, generally a tree. Some philodendron have a symbiotic relationship with ants. A lot of philodendron have extrafloral nectaries, which are glands that secrete a sugary liquid that is loved by these ants, and in turn the ants can provide some kind of service to the philodendron plant, whether that be fighting off disease or pests, or just having excess nutrients from the ant nest at the bottom of the plant. If you want more detail on extrafloral nectaries, you can check out episode 5 of my Plant Basic series, which is all about the fascinating and wonderful extrafloral nectaries that we get from a lot of our plants indoors. The leaves of philodendron plants are usually large, oval. They can be more or less pinnate, they can be spear-shaped, they can be heart-shaped. There's quite a large variety because of how big the genus is. Later in the plant's life, it will undergo a sort of metamorphosis where it starts to transition really into creating mature leaves. And this is really, I guess, the goal of growing philodendron indoors is to reach this stage. It's usually a gradual process in the wild. However, there are some things that people speculate could be a trigger for this metamorphosis. One of these potential triggers could be an increase in light, and this will happen when the philodendron is growing up a large tree. It will get higher up in the canopy therefore have more access to light and can justify having a larger leaf and more surface on the leaf to take in that beautiful sunlight. A second trigger is thought to be when the aerial roots, which are a different type of root generally used for attaching themselves to these large tree structures. So when these aerial roots actually grow downwards and reach the soil at the base of whatever it's growing on, it can then get access to an increase in nutrients. And this is thought to potentially be a trigger for creating mature leaves. Philodendron reproduction is generally through an inflorescence, which has male and female parts, which is essentially the flower of the plant. And philodendron are typically pollinated by beetles. Within the spathe, which is the structure that kind of encapsulates the outside of this inflorescence, this can actually be a popular breeding spot for beetles. And this is handy for the male beetles because the inflorescence will emit a sort of pheromone when it comes to dusk to attract the beetles to the flower, meaning all the ladies be coming into the spathe and the males are there waiting. And this breeding process in the inflorescence is a fantastic way for transfer of pollen between the male and female parts. And once this is successful, philodendron produce a fruit known as a berry. It is thought to taste like bananas, but it does have calcium oxalate crystals in it, which are poisonous. So I wouldn't, if you have access, maybe don't go tasting it straight away. So philodendron were collected from the wild as early as 1644, and they are generally found in the Americas and West Indies. Therefore, the habitat that philodendron know and love are humid tropical forests, but are also found to grow in swamps, riverbanks, roadsides, and rocky outcrops. But in general, they like it warm, they like it humid, and generally are in a kind of a, maybe they would start their life cycle in a lower light level, and as they grow up, whatever they are growing on, they will get access to more light and become more mature. So when it comes to my conditions of growing philodendron in my collection, it is massively varied. So I have philodendron in higher light situations, I have them in lower light situations, I have them kind of scattered throughout. However, they are not really in any of my high light situations, and that is because in general I find that highlight is just too much for them. More on that in the light section. But yeah, my conditions are, I mean, most of my growing happens in this room, if that's not obvious. I have a large east facing window here to my left, right for you, and that's a lot of light, to be very honest. But on top of that, I have 3 grow lights in here. I have one smaller spider farmer light, I have a large, very powerful spider farmer light, and then I have a smaller Sansi light with the 3 bulbs here. And that's the extent of my artificial lighting. This is much more kind of directed, but you know, as you can see, there's a lot of growing here in dark patches. There is a lot of light in this room for this video. However, as you can see, there's quite a lot of different situations. This is also philodendron. I have a lot of them here. I have some up here. The humidity in this room generally fluctuates between 55 and 70%, but I would guess on average it's probably 60 within that range. When it does get hotter, the humidity increases. Unless I'm starting to open windows and get some airflow in here, it generally decreases. Temperatures could be anywhere from 16 or 17 degrees in the winter to up to 30 in summer, which is very hot, I know, to be having in, that's degrees Celsius, by the way. But yeah, very hot to be, this is my office, so that is quite hot. But in general, it's probably around 20 to 25 degrees most of the time. If it does get too hot in here, I do generally open the window because airflow is very important to me in my plant care style. And it's something I try to get the most of, but also balancing the temperatures and stuff because I do live in Ireland and it is not always very warm outside. So that is those are my conditions for growing philodendron. But let's get into the more detailed part of this video where we go through all the different elements of plant care for this genus. When it comes to light, philodendron are generally very forgiving, which is why they are such a popular houseplant and are a feature of most people's collections. So while they can live in lower light situations, they definitely won't thrive. You know, they might be slow in growth, but they will totally survive in that. I find highlight is far too much for my philodendron. I have attempted to grow philodendron in higher light situations and it has never really gone well. They could get bleaching or burning of the leaves. To be honest, for me, most frequently I saw the bleaching of the leaves on philodendron. And remember where they come from. So they are used to forest lighting, which is generally indirect and kind of dappled sunlight until they get super high in the canopy, but in general they will be shaded out by some species. So for that reason, on the forest floor they can live in low light, and once they find something to attach to and grow on, then they would prefer to get more light. So they're always kind of in search of that to mature and complete their life cycle. I do have a video on my channel that is related to too much light signs to look out for on your houseplants. So if you are interested in that, I will link it in the description, because that will go through all of the kind of things to notice if your plant is getting too much light. That could be an issue with some of your philodendron. So for me, with my philodendron, it's a good middle ground between low and high light. It's really a medium light situation, either a little bit set back from a grow light or a little bit set back from a window, depending on where that window is facing. If it's a south facing window, they may prefer to be slightly further back. But yeah, a kind of a good medium situation. As far as substrate goes, you really want a good chunky and airy mix for your philodendron. You do want some kind of moisture retention, some kind of organic component to your substrate mix. So that could be a coconut coir, or for organic content could be compost or something like that. So you always want that element as your base, but with additional amendments or components that will increase airflow to the roots. Things like bark, vermiculite, perlite, leca even. All of those kind of bigger chunks are going to help create a more airy mix. So in my experience, their roots really do prefer to have good airflow when it comes to that. Just always know that the chunkier mix that you have, the more often you're likely to need to water. So have a good balance between your plant care style and what the plant actually likes. But definitely the roots do not want to be in a very dense, clogged soil or substrate. I do have a video coming soon where I will go into a deep dive on substrates, all the different elements. If you are feeling lost, that is set to come out very soon, so it may give you a bit of a direction on what I'm talking about here if it doesn't make sense. For fertilizer, not too much. At my best, I am a very inconsistent fertilizer with my houseplants, and to be honest, it works for me. It is just the way I approach it. So I will fertilize all of my plants, to be honest. I usually fertilize them all at the same time, so that's philodendron included. I will fertilize them with a diluted organic, typically seaweed fertilizer every maybe 2 months. That's on a good schedule. But to be honest, if you have substrate or whatever is in your pot, basically, that has organic content, that isn't super old, that is providing your plant with ongoing nutrients. So that's kind of how I see it. If something may not necessarily need a bigger pot, but the substrate is very old and it's likely that the plant has used up all of the nutrients that were in that, I will typically refresh the soil. I'll usually mix it with further organic content, and the plants seem to be happy with that. So my fertilizing schedule is, as I said, inconsistent. I don't overly fertilize my plants. I just kind of try to mentally get that balance between having good organic content in the substrate and providing them with a diluted version every couple of months. And that's what does well for me. This is not the channel to come for if you're looking for very in-depth fertilizing breakdowns. I am not that kind of channel. Well, I'm not that kind of person, so that I don't talk about that in my videos. I have never really gone into kind of analysis on NPK, or, you know, I have dabbled in more kind of serious fertilizers, but for me, the organic stuff is just easier for me. So yeah, if you're looking for that, this is not the channel to be watching, but there are plenty out there that go in depth in these kinds of things if that's what you're looking for. Humidity. These plants grow in very high humidity environments in the wild that are generally quite warm. And so this is what they love. This is what they want out of life. However, it's very hard to provide those kinds of conditions when you're indoors without absolutely destroying your house. Like 70 to 90%, I'm assuming, in the wild is a really good humidity level for these plants, and they would appreciate that. But like I said, that's just not really going to happen indoors unless you are having like a grow tent, terrarium type of situation. In general, philodendron don't work that well in terrariums unless it's a very tall one. But yes, I don't grow any philodendron in a terrarium or a grow tent. So despite wanting higher humidity, I do find that they tend to tolerate it pretty well. Like I said, my conditions are generally between 55 and 70, which, to be honest, for an indoor environment is on the higher side. But yeah, I can grow quite successfully within that range, as long as I find I'm paying attention to all the different other elements of care that I'm talking about here. So, you know, paying close attention to light and watering and fertilizer and all those other bits, they will generally accept a lower humidity range in my experience. However, if it's something you would love to provide them with for an optimal condition, then definitely go for higher, 70 to 90% range. They wouldn't be unhappy with that. So for watering, which is, to be honest, quite the important thing when it comes to any kind of care tips video, watering is one of the most difficult things to get right with houseplants, especially if you're growing in pots. So for philodendron, they are no different. It is a fine balance in my experience to get these plants to thrive. Yes, they are forgiving and they are easy to care for in general, but to really make them mature and thrive, you want to be paying quite a lot of attention to your watering schedule in my experience. So if you're not careful, they can rot. Like I said, their roots tend to want a good bit of oxygen and airflow, and if you have a dense mixture or you're watering too frequently, this can lead to root rot, whether it be bacterial or just to do with the substrate as well. But on the other hand, if they are too dry, which, to be honest, in the past was definitely an issue I had with my philodendron, on not really making a correlation for a while about why my plants' leaves were not getting bigger, why they weren't bursting out in growth. It was actually because they were too dry. So if they're too dry, on the extreme end, their leaves can crisp up. Their aerial roots, I find, are less likely to grow long and happily. But on the less obvious side, it could be just something to do with stunted growth and smaller leaves. So I think that the plant thinks that it's just not getting enough to sustain a larger leaf structure or bigger aerial roots, for example. So usually, because a lot of my philodendron are quite large, they're generally in larger pots. And so as far as how often I water, I do let them dry out, right? But I don't let them dry out for very long. I would say a maximum of 1 to 2 days of being dry before I'd water them through fully. But yeah, just don't leave them dry for too long, but you do definitely want the soil or the substrate to be drying out in between the waterings as well, if that makes sense. One thing I will say about philodendron is that they love a good shower. So often this is how I water my philodendron unless I'm rushing out the door or have something else going on. But I will just put them in the shower and wash them down, wash the leaves down, wash whatever they're growing on, whether it's a branch or a pole, and just water through the soil fully. And they seem to really enjoy that. I do think coming from a wet, humid, tropical environment, I think they like it on some level. I have nothing to back that up, but that's how I feel. And I mean, why not? In relation to pests and diseases, so I have had quite a few things happen throughout that, but also remember that it is the most common genus in my houseplant collection and it is my favorite. So it's also, like I said at the beginning, what I have the most experience in, and generally that's where you'll encounter more situations. So I have had thrips, very bad on philodendron, can really decimate a collection. Ongoing treatment, preventative treatment is how I keep that away. I haven't had thrips in years, but I also found that when I stopped buying so many plants and constantly introducing new things to this ecosystem, I honestly haven't had pest issues in a long time. So that is a big factor. I also have had mealybugs, which to be honest, in my experience, are quite easily treated and noticeable. So you get them before they're, gotten really bad. Spider mites I have had, not so much now that I don't let them dry out too much, because spider mites do like dry conditions. So the showering helps with keeping them at bay, and yeah, I think that just hasn't been an issue, but in general pests haven't either, so take that with a grain of salt. Root rot is definitely a disease that has affected my philodendron. Like I said, it can be a watering thing, it can be a bacterial thing. So if signs of root rot could be mushy leaves, it could be kind of yellow/brown spots on the leaves, I find can be a big sign of there being a problem with your roots. So it's always best, if you're noticing something like that, take out the roots, have a good look at them. Try not to disturb them too much while you're doing this, because if they're fine, you're going to want to put them straight back in. But just have a little inspection. Is there any signs of mushy roots, desiccated roots, rotting roots? Yeah, it will generally show up in the leaves of the plant if that is what is happening below the soil. So pruning, I guess, / propagating. This is something that is so common with philodendron. In general, these plants, most of them will have 1 or 2 stems when you're growing them. Some of them, like for example, your philodendron hederaceum, will have many different stems going on, but for the most of them that have the 1 or 2 stems, a lot of people like to take cuttings. Either they're going to root them and sell them or give them away, or it could be to just restart the plant or something like that. But this is something I've actually stopped doing with most of my collection for probably the last 2 years, to be honest. And this has actually been a huge factor in growing my plants successfully and to a mature level, more mature level. So when, this doesn't really happen in the wild, unless a leaf or a stem breaks or something like that, the plants won't be stunted in their growth in this way. And so that's why I kind of stopped doing that. Every time you do that, you're kind of putting stress on the plant and you're telling them, you need to restart, you need to redirect your energy. And I find that slows them down in terms of growth, but also it can discourage either growing aerial roots or growing larger leaves. So I find just let your plant do its thing. Don't get in the way. Don't try and fix or control, but just let them be. Provide them with the conditions that they need to thrive, and then let them. I know it sounds really simple, but it's something that really took a long time to click with me. I think being online and seeing how other people take care of their plants, it just felt to me that it's something I should be doing, but and just kind of did it thoughtlessly, but you really don't need to. And actually I've grown much more successfully when I stopped doing that. The only time that I would do that now is, yes, if I want to root something and give it away, or if the plant is getting to a stage where it's unstable, so it might grow over the stake or something and I need to restart it, or yeah. That's kind of the only situation I would do that in, but otherwise I leave them be. So other notes on philodendron in general and how I care for them. So this is non-specific, but of course philodendron, the tree lover, they want something to grow on. In general, these are climbing plants and they want something to provide them with support as they grow big and tall. So providing a support is a really big part of growing these plants. And in the past I have used, or I still use on quite a few of my plants, branches that I've collected from the wild. I have a video all about that I will also link in the description if you want to watch. That's been very successful for me. Quite recently I have used these large wooden stakes that are rough sawn wood that is untreated, as you can see here, and I have some over here. It's a recent video I did on big stakes for my philodendron. That is working very, very well and is definitely a new lovely way to grow them. And also growing them on a flat cork board has also been massively successful. So, and I have a video on that as well, which I will also link if you're interested. So you want to provide them with that support. It's a really big part of caring for these plants. Another thing that I do with pretty much all of my philodendron is clean the leaves pretty regularly. The showering really helps with this. I mean, it washes off any dust that has settled on the leaves. I find it just kind of, I don't know, maybe it's in my head. Maybe it's not a real thing at all, but it is something that I do. I'll generally wash them with either a diluted soap mixture or just water. I'll just gently wipe down the leaves. I think that this, in my head, maximizes photosynthesis. There's nothing getting in the way, and it just helps them to look their best. This is not necessarily a care tips thing, but just something to note. If you're growing philodendron and you want to grow them in a similar way that I have, in the sense that you want them to grow mature and wild, you need a lot of space. And it is something worth noting, especially because a lot of them grow upwards. They need a lot of upward space, and they can also be quite wide, you know, like they can take up a lot more space than you think they would. Definitely this corner has just become a wall of green and you know, I absolutely love that, but it is something that I'm going to be dealing with in an ongoing way, because as they get bigger they take up more space and then you don't really know what to do with them. So we'll see what happens with a lot of mine in the future, but it is fantastic to see them so happy. So just as a final part to this video, just a little show and tell of some of my philodendron. This is not all of them, I believe, but it is most of them. So I have philodendron verrucosum. I have a small one above my desk and I have a larger one growing on the corkboard. Verrucosum definitely less likely to grow aerial roots and grow large. It is an ongoing thing I have with this plant. I find maybe it's to do with the velvet leaves, I'm not quite sure, but it struggles a little bit more than my other ones. Philodendron pedatum, my pride and joy, my huge girl, nearing 3 meters high now. Just growing out of control, and so happy. I've had this plant for a long time and I've grown it from a very small 2-leaf plant, 2 or 3 leaves, until now. Philodendron sagittifolium, species affinity sagittifolium. This is what I think it is, but I'm not quite sure. Another massive philodendron, much more weighty, has a really thick stem, is growing very happily. And I have had this for 4 years now, which I've only just realized. Yeah, it's quite a big one. Maybe it's time I do an update. Then I have my Beetiae ex Atabapoense. So this is a hybrid between those two species. Definitely less successful growing this one. You can see where I have cut it because it did get quite unstable where it was. The internodal spacing is quite large and I find that difficult with this plant, but we're working through it and it's definitely getting there. My Philodendron gloriosum, I did a big video on this recently. It used to be so large. I'll include old clips if I can, but I recently had to cut this because it was just growing out of control. It was way too heavy. Most of it was growing outside the pot and it was also at a top shelf, which was getting a little bit dangerous. But it's growing now. It has produced 2 new leaves popping out of where I cut, so it is happy. Philodendron squamiferum beside me also recently got a stake in that last video and is very happy. A plant that took me many years to figure out, I'll be honest. And the big key for this one was more consistent and frequent watering than I was doing previously, and the leaves have gotten bigger and it seems happy. Philodendron tortum, a very interesting species, looks quite different to other ones in my collection as far as the kind of leaf surface. Looks more like a fern, but is very beautiful. Definitely more compact growth, but does grow tall. I have had it quite tall before, and when we moved house it snapped, so that's why it went shorter again. But it's happy, but definitely a bit slower growing. And finally, just another one to note in this room is my Philodendron hederaceum. Quite a happy plant, very different growth texture. You can grow this upwards to become more mature. However, that is quite difficult in my experience indoors, and I prefer growing this plant as a kind of a trailing house plant. That just suits me a little bit better, but it is a very fast grower, very easily found and quite cheap. It is a very common house plant, but it is also very beautiful and I love the way it looks in this room. So that is it for the big, huge Philodendron care tips video. I hope that this was useful. If you have any additional tips or anything else that you want to add to this, please do so in the comments below. If you're someone that has cared for these for a long time, maybe you still got something out of it. I hope that you did. If this is new to you, this is a really good, in my opinion, foundation for growing a lot of these plants. And as always, a very useful thing to do when you have a new plant or you're trying to figure out how to grow something, look at where it came from in the wild. It sounds very simple, but I don't think it is a very commonly done thing. Check where it grows in the wild and that will tell you what it likes. So that's what you'll want to emulate. That's really the simplest way to approach plant care indoors. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, you can let me know for free by giving this a like, a comment, or even subscribing for future videos. Thank you so much to my lovely patrons for supporting me again this month. Thank you so much to Amanda, Amy, Grace, Hope, Michael and Yendi for your support this month. It truly means the world to me. If you're interested in checking out the Patreon, the link is in the description of the video. Other than that, thank you. I will see you very soon in the next video. Bye.